So many of you. I was last here 25 years ago. You were still at school. Things have changed. You got older, wiser, cleverer. Nice to be back. Thank you for asking me. Johannes Gutenberg, 14th century, first information revolution, printing press, movable type. He gave us books. But he caused a social revolution. Until he came along, the only people who had knowledge, who had information, were the elite, were the priests. But suddenly, well, not suddenly, it took 50, 60, 70 years, most people had a book in their homes, often the Bible, which in many cases they could read in their own language. Suddenly, they didn't need the priests anymore. Everybody could make up their own minds about what was in the Bible. And so the power of the priests, who were the controllers of knowledge, disappeared. It was true, a dramatic, democratic revolution. It led on to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to a whole new social structure. And the same thing is happening again now with the internet. If you've been to London, or if you come to London, you will know about our special taxis, the black cabs of London. You could not get a license to drive a black cab in London until you had done what they called the knowledge. You had to take an exam to prove that you knew every street in the center of London and the quickest way to get from A to B. It took people a year to learn all that, and then it was up here. And so they were very special people, and they were good taxi drivers. And then the internet came, and we had sat-navs, GPS. Everybody had the knowledge. It counted for nothing that they had passed that exam. So now they had Uber, or you had your own cars. And the knowledge that they had gained all those years ago was worthless. They still had some advantages. They had these big cabs that were easier to get into. They were the only ones that were allowed to pick you up in the street. Everybody else you had to book ahead of time. And they were allowed to go down the bus lanes. But the knowledge that they had spent a year accumulating was worthless. So I'd like you to remember, that's what the information revolution does. It destroys the power of knowledge. And so it destroys the role of many people in organizations who think they have more knowledge, more information than you. They don't anymore. You can have it all. And that's why organizations are going to change. That's the first thing I want to say to you. The second is this. This is the line of life. All life, whether it's your life, the product's life, the organization's life, the country's life, the government's life, it starts with a dip because you put more in than you get out. It's called investment. It's called education. It's called experiment and learning. But soon you start to grow. But nothing lasts forever. There comes a time when you start going downhill. I have fun sometimes going into organizations And I say to people in the organization, where on this line do you think you are, your organization? And so some people at the top say about halfway up. And if you ask people lower down in the organization, they say, we're over the top. We're going down. And if I say to you, where are you in your life? Halfway up? At the top? Or going down? That's so sad. But you don't have to be too sad, because you can start a second curve. And the organization can start a second curve. But you see, you have to start it while you still have room for this investment, new learning, new experiment, which in my experience, whether you're an individual or an organization, takes 2 years before you take off. And the trouble is, where you have to start, that's when everything is looking good. You think you've got the secret. You think you know how to work the world. The trouble is, over the corner, round the bend, it'll change. But you don't believe that. You think this will go on forever. I have a story to ask you to remember. I sound like an Englishman, but I'm really an Irishman. We don't like the English. I was born in Dublin, and when I go back to Ireland, I drive in the hills behind Dublin. But they keep changing the roads. So one time, I was not sure that I was on the right road. So when I saw an Irishman by the side with his dog, I said to him, am I on the right road to Avoca, where I was going? And he said, ah, yes, indeed you are, sir. You go straight on up this hill, and when you get to the top, you look down into the little valley, and you see a stream and a bridge, and across the bridge you'll see Davy's Bar. You can't miss Davy's Bar, he said. It's painted bright red. Have you got that? I said, yes, up the hill, look for Davy's Bar. Right, he said. Well, 1 kilometer before you get there, turn right up the hill. So I drove off, and I thought, hey, he said before, didn't he? Not after. Oh, well, I'll keep looking once I see Davy's Bar. So I go to the top of the hill, I look down, I see Davy's Bar. So I drive very slowly, looking to the right. No road. I get to Davy's Bar. No road. Must have missed something. I turn back. Go up. Ah, the wretched man did not tell me that the road to the right came before I got to the top of the hill, so I couldn't see Davy's Bar. The trouble is, you see, most organizations that I know don't change until they see Davy's Bar, until they know where they're going downhill, and they can see that they're going to be bankrupt or something. Because the catch-22, the paradox of the second curve, as I call it, is that you don't know whether it begins until you've gone past it. So the only tip I can give you is when you feel completely content with your work, or the organization really feels pretty pleased with itself, that's the time to start the second curve, to reinvent yourself. Sometimes you get a shove, and I think that's what's happening now. The information revolution is saying to you, it is time to think again about your life about your organization. And I say to you, at this moment, it is terribly important that you people take responsibility to make sure that the technology does not drown the human being. Because we have these mysterious things called algorithms that are beginning to run our life. And you don't know what's in them. Did you know that some airlines punish you as a family if you don't book ahead and pay a little extra to choose your seats? If you don't do that, the algorithm will split up the family across all the different seats. And they will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's the way it is." But it's an algorithm that is punishing you for not booking ahead and paying a little more money. There are all sorts of mysterious things happening to you through technology. And it is, I think, your job to make sure that the humans are still the people who matter. And I will tell you why and how that's going to happen. So just remember, Davies Bar is round the corner. You don't want to end up there, because if you're there, it's too late. It's too late. I wrote a book about the second curve, applying it to all sorts of things, not just individuals, but also political parties, how we run the government, all sorts of things. I don't think it's in Lithuanian, but you all read English, and you can get it on Amazon. This is where I live, in London. I only live in a bit of it, but that's part of the story, because this is my symbol of the new organization. You see, this house in London was built in 1890 for one family. The servants lived at the top. The chauffeur, he was the coachman, actually, who drove the horses, lived in the house here on the side. And the big rooms were at the bottom, and there was a huge garden. And it was one organization, and it was a hierarchical organization. There was a boss, the head of the family. And then there were the children, the middle managers. And then there were the servants, the workers. Like a typical organization. Now, there are 8 apartments there. I live in one of them. We all share that building. We all share some of the expenses. When we had to put a new roof on it, we all contributed, even though only the people at the top really benefited. And I think that's what's happening to our organizations. On the outside, they will look the same. But on the inside, they're divided up into small groups. And they're connected not by management, not by bosses telling people what to do, but by information, by what people these days call a platform in many cases, which is basically a great big complicated website, which all these little bits of the organization log into and know what each other is doing. And somebody in the center can control bits of it, but they control it through information, not through hierarchy, not through command, not by ordering people around. And that's what makes what they call an agile corporation, because there's much more room for these little groups to do things differently in their own way. The most obvious example for this organization is actually in China, would you believe? An organization called HR. HR makes washing machines. HR makes refrigerators. HR makes dishwashers. HR makes white goods, solid things, which you would think mean lots of assembly lines and a big conventional organization. And HR employs 70,000 people. Big. But they're all, or most of them, are divided into small groups. Maybe 8, 10, 15, 20 people in each. And they have quite a lot of control over how they do things and how they connect with their customers. And if they do things better, if they make savings or make more money, they can keep some of it for the group, for themselves. Who would think that a model of the new organization would come from China, which we assume to be a great big bureaucracy? But it isn't. There are signs of the future in China as well as in America or in Europe. So just remember my house. It looks the same on the outside, but inside it's quite different. Now, this is what these little groups look like. This is my new management theory, the donut theory of organizations. Very important. It's an English donut. The jam is in the middle. It's not an American donut where there's a hole in the middle. They call it a bagel. The point of the donut, it's like, just as this drawing, the bit in the center, the jam, that's the bit that you have to do, because if you don't do it, you will have failed. You could say that's your basic target, your basic responsibility. But that's not the whole of the donut. Around that area, there's a lot of space. And that's the space for you as a group to do things differently, and I hope better. This is the bit where nobody tells you what to do. This is the scope for your creativity, your imagination, you to be an entrepreneur with your group. That's what makes life exciting, when you can make a difference. You're not just a cog. You are a human being. You're not just a robot controlled by robots, which sometimes you think you are in a big organization. And the new design for organizations is to design donuts for groups and tell them what their basic job is, basic target is, but to leave them room to move around. So how do you know if you're in charge of the organization? How do you know that people go out and use their initiative in the empty space? How do you know they won't muck things up, make a terrible mistake? Well, you have to trust them. And they have to know what the purposes of the organization are. There is a bank in Europe, a Swedish bank called Handelsbanken. And they decided that they would create a very decentralized organization. They hadn't read my book, so they didn't call it a donut organization. They should have. They said to their bank branches in Sweden and in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and now in Britain, your branch is responsible for everything that you can see from the top of your church spire or church tower. In other words, an area of about 20 miles around. And so they mapped out the areas around the branches, and they said in that area you have total discretion to do what you think is right. So what you think is right must be what the organization thinks is right. So they must be very clear what the aims of the organization are, what its values are, how it works, what it's trying to do. And if they do that, then they can. And the center is not allowed to interfere. Somebody, the chief executive, was telling me the other day in England that they had introduced a credit card for the bank. And each bank had the credit card to give to its customers. And he said, I caught the finance officer, because they have very few people in the center, but one of them is the finance officer who keeps an eye on the money. I caught the finance manager checking to see which branch was doing best in using the credit card. And I had to say, stop it, you must not look. They're independent. If they think you are checking on them, it won't work. The trouble with this information thing is that you can use it to give people information and freedom, or you can use it to check on them. But if you start checking on them, they won't use their imagination, because they think they will have to check back with you that it's okay. So you have to be very strong, if you're the manager in the center, to give away this freedom. And you must make very sure that they know what your values are. I once joined a bit of Anglo-American, which is a South African mining company. And they were trying to get money out of South Africa and invest it in European countries and companies because they thought it would be safer. And I was there, I was quite young, to advise them what kind of companies they should buy. It's a big responsibility. I didn't know. So I said to my boss in London, but what is the criteria? What am I looking for? He said, you just imagine what Harry would do. Harry was Harry Oppenheimer, who was the big boss in Johannesburg of this company. But I had never met Harry. So how was I to know? But they said, well, ask people who know Harry to find out what Harry would do. And that was the guidance they gave me. And so, in a sense, they were right. I had to find out what the values and instincts of this company were. So, how can you make sure that people in these donuts know what they have to do? Well, the first answer, basically, is keep it small. This is Robin Dunbar, a professor at Oxford. And he has been studying groups from the beginning of civilization until now. And he has discovered that the maximum size of a group in which you can know people well enough to know whether you can trust them or not, the maximum size is 150 people. That's called the Dunbar number. It's roughly the maximum number of Facebook friends you can have. Roughly the number of people on your biggest Christmas card list, if you send Christmas cards. I think it's the very maximum. I say you cannot trust anyone unless you have been close enough to them to smell them. How many people can you smell? There are maybe 700 people in this room. This is too big for my Robin Dunbar. I think probably if I divided you all into groups, 50 maybe? It's too big. Maybe 20. Better still, 10. Those people you can know well enough to smell. Those people you can know whether you can trust them and work together or not. So my ideal organization now is groups of between 10 and 50 people. And the exciting thing is that whatever your organization is doing, the technology allows you to divide it up like that. And then you can have agile donuts, people using their initiative at every level. And all of you can be in a group of another 10 to 15 people, and you can sit there smelling each other and decide what you're going to do tomorrow. And that makes life exciting, because you can make a difference to the world. A little difference, but little differences ripple out. And organizations become exciting places to be in. And it seems to me that's your job, to make them exciting places for human beings to be in, using the technology to do all the boring bits. And that, I think, is the really exciting opportunity that you have. And lastly, we'll go back to this man, who is the wisest man who ever lived, I think. I had to spend some of my youth studying him, and he was a great bore because his writings are in lecture notes. They're not very easy to read in Greek. But when you translate them and understand them, there's a lot of wisdom there. Aristotle was interested in finding out the reason for life, amongst many other things. And he decided that the reason for living was basically to live what he called the good life. And his recipe for that was something called eudaimonia. It's a long Greek word. Most people translate it as happiness. But Aristotle did not mean pleasure. He did not mean lying on a beach with your best buddy with a bottle of wine and the sun shining. That was not what Aristotle called happiness. He thought happiness was to be more active, something more like self-fulfillment. I translate it in my sort of funny way by saying what Aristotle wanted us all to do is to do the best with what we're best at for the good of others. Philosophers are funny people. Whenever they give you an answer, it turns out to be a question. So doing your best at what you're best at is actually a question. What are you best at? Do you know? And are you in a position to do your best with it? And it must be for the sake of others, because, says Aristotle, if it's only for yourself, it's a bit pointless. It's not going to make a difference to the world. It must make a difference to other people. So I want you to use what influence and power you have to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to do the best at what they're best at for the good of others. And actually, you know, if you're running the organization, it's not a bad question to ask the organization. What are you best at? And are you doing it for the good of others? Or just for yourself and your shareholders? Because that's a bit silly and sick, isn't it? And do you know what you're best at? I believe every one of us is very good at something, what I call a golden seed, somewhere in you, that if you can fertilize it, water it, it grows, that you become much more important and powerful. You may not know what it is, but maybe your mother does. When I left home after university, I joined an oil company. My parents, my father was a pastor in a little country village in Ireland, and they didn't know what an oil company was. They thought I'd be putting gasoline into cars on a forecourt. But I was posted out to Southeast Asia, and as I said goodbye to them to get into the car to take me to the airport, my mother said, "Well, dear," she said, "at least it'll be great material for your books." "Books, Mother?" I said. "I'm going to be an oil executive. No time for books." "Yes, dear," she said, the way mothers do, where they may mean no, dear. "Yes, dear, but it'll be good for your books." 20 years later, I gave her my first book. Sometimes mothers, or your first teacher, or your first boss knows something about you that you never even dreamt of. And maybe people in your organization have something special about them that only you will know. Tell them. Tell them. Tell them they're special. Make sure they have room to express themselves, space to shake themselves, to make a difference. Then you will deserve your job. These people in the organization, they're not things, they're not human resources. They are resourceful humans. I'm sure you will remember that. And I hope you'll remember some of my pictures. Thank you very much.